Welcome, everyone. I'm Jane Noah-Sadko, Head of Public Programs here at the Yale Center for British Art, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the opening program for the exhibition Bill Brandt, Henry Moore, now in view in our third-floor galleries. This exhibition was curated by Martina Droth, Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Yale Center for British Art, and organized in partnership with the Hepworth Wakefield in the UK. It was on view at the Hepworth Wakefield in 2020 and at the Sainsbury Centre at the University of East Anglia in 2021. The exhibition and its accompanying publication have been generously supported by David Deckman and Michael Messier, Laura and James Duncan, Yale BA 1975, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the John Pritzker Family Fund. I'm now going to read the land acknowledgement. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shagtacoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. This opening conversation will provide an introduction to the themes of the exhibition. We welcome Martina Droth, Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the YCBA, and Paul Messier, the Pritzker Director of the Lens Media Lab at the Yale Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. Together, Martina and Paul edited the beautiful publication that accompanies our exhibition. They will take us behind the scenes of their project and discuss the challenges of creating a book and an exhibition that bring photography and sculpture into conversation. Now we welcome Paul and Martina. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks, Jane, and welcome everyone. It's so nice to see you in person. Also want to welcome those joining on the live stream. And as you heard, this exhibition has had a long durée. It opened in 2020 and is finally here with all of the COVID delays that have happened. So I will begin with an overview of the exhibition and its themes, and then Paul and I will talk in a little bit more detail about what we set out to do with this project. So this exhibition re-examines two very well-known figures, Bill Brandt, associated with photography, and Henry Moore, who's associated with sculpture. And we're very used to seeing these two artists treated individually and monographically within their fields, within those media. This exhibition seeks to break down some of those silos and to look at a broader range of materials, to think about process, and to put the works back into the historical context in which they were made, and in fact remade over the decades of their career. The two artists came together under the circumstances of the Second World War, when they, amongst many other artists, were making a visual response to the events that were unfolding, in this case mostly in London. Both artists were working under the auspices of the British government, the Ministry of Information specifically. And the Ministry of Information was seeking, encouraging, and facilitating at the same time as it was also controlling and censoring the production of pictures and their circulation in news and media. Bill Brandt and Henry Moore first met when the photographer visited the sculptor at his studio in Much Haddam to take this portrait in 1942. And he took the portrait in order to publish it. And this was true of Bill Brandt for much of his career, is that he worked on commission, and much of the portraits that he did through his life, he made in order to publish them in magazines and journals. So this photograph was taken for Lilliput, and its purpose was to serve as a frontispiece for this little photo story, where Bill Brandt is juxtaposing his photographs of the London underground shelters, where people were sheltering in 1940 during the Blitz, juxtaposing the photographs with these now very iconic drawings by Henry Moore of the London underground shelters. So the exhibition begins with these evocative and haunting wartime works that we're so familiar with today. These are among the most famous works that the artists made in their career, and examines them in the context of the war and how they were reproduced and published. There's also a section that looks at coal mining. Both Bill Brandt and Henry Moore took an interest in some of the national subjects that became important. When Henry Moore finished his shelter drawings, he was encouraged or prompted to turn his attention to coal mining. And of course, coal mining was very much in the national interest during the war. There wasn't enough coal being produced. And he produced these drawings in the mine that his father had worked in, going down that mine for the first time. Articles like this were published. And at the same time, the government was conscripting young men down into the coal mines because there wasn't enough coal being produced. So it was part of the war effort. Bill Brandt, meanwhile, had taken photographs of coal mining communities in the north of England in the late 1930s. Very different kinds of pictures, as you'll see upstairs, where he's really focusing not so much on the miners at work, but really on the effects of living in the shadows of the coal mines, housing at the bottom of slag heaps, coal dust in houses and on bodies, children playing on the slag heaps. So there's some incredible photographs that you'll see upstairs, sort of recording those scenes. And those photographs kind of remained dormant for a period of time, but were used later on. In this example, his famous picture of a coal searcher was published in Picture Post in 1947 as part of an issue that looked at Britain in crisis, Britain seeking to rebuild and to move away from scenes like this. On the cover of that very same issue of Picture Post was another photograph by Bill Brandt, taken in 1947 of the deadly winter crisis that was happening, snow-covered landscape, fuel shortage, and it sort of stands as this title image, Where Stands Britain? So it's both sort of proclaiming the winter crisis in this terrible moment, but also sort of presenting Stonehenge as the symbol of hope, of Britain everlasting, British sovereignty, as Britain is moving out of the war into the post-war era. Stonehenge, Avebury, and the megalithic sites were subjects of great importance, also of national importance at the time. And for Bill Brandt and Henry Moore, they were of interest also because of their formal properties, like these kind of mysterious abstract sculptures in the landscape. Bill Brandt photographed all kinds of found objects in the landscape, thinking about the inspiration of Stonehenge and the megalithic sites, but also thinking about modern sculpture. These are snaps that he took on the beaches of natural found objects and sort of setting them up as though they're sculptures in the landscape. And here you see him taking a photograph of a work by Barbara Hepworth, actually quite a small piece, carried down from her studio to the beach, the base buried in the sand, but photographed as though it's a megalithic, everlasting sculpture rising up from the ocean. During the war, Henry Moore wasn't making much sculpture. He really became a draftsman, but he was constantly imagining his sculptures in the landscape. And here you see him contemplating a large reclining figure sculpture in front of these mysterious standing stones in the background. He visited Stonehenge multiple times, and then in the 1970s, he produced this beautiful album of lithographs that were based on photographs of Stonehenge. And I think you get a sense of kind of photographic qualities that he brought into drawing these pictures. Both artists were very interested in how you photograph three-dimensional objects on the surface of a one-dimensional, well, actually four-dimensional, as we'll talk about, but on the flat surface of a photographic image. And I love these negatives that we discovered in the Bill Brandt archive, unpublished, snapped by Bill Brandt, perhaps in an idle moment in the studio, waiting for Henry Moore to turn up to have his portrait taken, and unprinted, but really sort of showing that thought process of photographing sculpture in the round. And Henry Moore was doing the same thing, of course, very invested in how to photograph a three-dimensional object. This is Henry Moore experimenting with bronze cast that he owned of a Rodin sculpture, taking it outdoors, putting a white background behind it, and taking photographs of it from different angles. And these are sitting in the Henry Moore Foundation archive. The photographic archive of Henry Moore consists of more than 200,000 works. And it's very clear when you start looking through the archives that he was deeply invested in the medium of photography. In 1945, when he began this enormous limewood sculpture that took 2+ years to carve, he set up a large format camera, and the glass plate negatives are in the Henry Moore Foundation archive, and did this time-lapse sequence, which I find so fascinating, that he kept that camera there in the same position for 2+ years. And then, when he exhibited that sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in 1946, a big moment for him, first sort of international solo show after the war, those appeared in the accompanying exhibition catalogue. And I think this gives you a good insight into how much Henry Moore was controlling the photographic image of his work and how he wanted his sculpture to be seen. And I just wanted to add this example too of a Henry Moore exhibition in which he produced sort of poster-sized photographs of his sculptures, monumental sculptures that he couldn't bring into the exhibition, to be alongside his works and be represented. Bill Brandt was also often talked about in terms of his kind of sculptural eye and his sculptural interests through his kind of photographic method. And that was an idea he himself promoted. There are 2 photographs here by Bill Brandt that he took in the 1930s of stone sculptures by the French artist Yale. And then he went back to these kind of unused pictures that hadn't sort of found their function yet, and reproduced them alongside his very iconic photograph of body parts, his so-called nudes on the beach, making that analogy between sculpture and the body. And the exhibition upstairs has a number of those works, probably among the most famous of Bill Brandt's oeuvre. And the way in which he's sort of setting up the body on the beach and suggesting that the body is like a sculptural form, is akin to stones and rocks and pebbles, is also something that he kind of, in a more playful way, brought back into these collage works, where he was collecting bits of flotsam from the beach, stones and pebbles and shells, and then making these arrangements. Not unlike Henry Moore, also collecting famously what he called his natural library of forms, of bits and pieces of flint and stones and shells, which he then would set up in the studio, photograph, to have sculptural ideas for works that he might then work up into sculptures, or to cut up the photograph and make a collage such as this. So I think you'll find some works upstairs in the exhibition that show other sides of these artists' oeuvres that haven't been explored as much. One of the things that Paul and I were very conscious of as we were getting into this project was that when it comes to an artist like Henry Moore and when it comes to sculpture, we're very accustomed to being conscious of the materiality of the work, its physicality and its dimensionality. But when it comes to photographs, it's very easy to reduce the photograph to the image, and that's something we wanted to avoid. But I'll let Paul talk a little bit about that.
That's great. Thanks, Martina. And thanks to all of you for coming out. And thanks to everyone joining online, and especially thanks to Martina for inviting me into this project. And as Martina was saying, photographs, we tend to think of photographs as image and maybe not object. Objects that occupy space and have interactions with the environment over time. And also, I think we tend to sometimes think that photographic prints are somehow mechanically produced, but in fact, they are the product of a tremendous amount of work in the darkroom, creative work, surprises, setbacks, challenges, and all of that is very present in Bill Brandt's work. Bill Brandt himself is very present in his prints. He's working and reworking aspects of his prints on the surface with all different kinds of media, airbrush, inks, and pencil, and etching things out with knives. And He was part of a, well, let's just go to the next slide. I think maybe this will explain it better. I'm going to show you something. This is a sample book of photographic papers. It was produced in the 1930s. Bill Brandt would have been very familiar with this company, a Belgian company called Gevert. I'm just going to open it up. I love this, right? I mean, how can you not love this? This object really begs this question. You know, in what world did you need about 40 or so photographic surfaces? Well, really in the world of the 1930s. I mean, when black and white photography was really the preeminent visual medium of the day. And any, professional working photographer would have been familiar with the different dimensions of texture, gloss, color. You can see the color dimension, the color differences here. The texture, of course, you can't see the texture in a computer-based image, nor can you really see the gloss very well. But you can, you get a sense of the different expressive potential of photographic prints. There are prints here there are papers here that are designed really to reflect and record nature, preserve detail. There are papers here that are designed to do the opposite, break up detail, generalize form. So there are papers that are really for kind of, if you're thinking about an objective view of the world, a recording of the world, versus your interpretation of the world. And if you're kind of alert to that axis, between subjective and objective, Bill Brandt traveled on that axis quite a bit, and it's all upstairs in the show. Some of the early prints of Brandt's were very much, in a photojournalist's vein, and they were going straight into print. So there are very particular papers for that. At the end of his career, well, towards the end of his career, as he's, working with, where he becomes kind of a fully realized fine artist, and he's showing in galleries, he's using more kind of papers that are more demonstrating his subjective, interpretive approach to his subjects. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about, show you a few more pictures, I think, which we're really going to do. So if a photograph exists in space and in time, well, you should be able to flip it over. And that's one of the things that was so enlightening through this process of how engaged Bill Brandt was with his printmaking and how much control he really exerted from making the print all the way through its production and its later appearance on the printed page. So this is coal searchers in northeastern Britain. And what's amazing is, he's very careful. If you see he calls out the train on the caption. You can see that this print appeared in Shadow of Light in 1966, his, wonderful book that he made. That train is really, it's there, but he's really worked it up on the print with airbrush and other techniques to emphasize it. And he's attentive to that detail, and he calls out that detail because it's such an important part of this picture, right? I mean, here are the coal searchers looking for scraps of coal in a slag heap. Meanwhile, these train loads of coal are being removed from the land and taken elsewhere. Kind of in a similar vein, this was a print made in Jarrow in 1937. Jarrow had it was called, Jarrow was Murdered, was one account. There was a shipbuilding company there that employed like 2/3 of the people in town. And when that shut down, it was an absolute economic disaster. This print appeared in, I think it was 1943 in Picture Post. And you can see on the back, you can see his captions. He's calling out the wallpaper, details of the stove even, how large it should appear, these cropping marks on the back. and just really just fully engaged with the process of going from capturing the image all the way through to its final appearance in print. And sort of the last example that I'll show along these lines, this is also during the war, a photograph made in the Elephant and Castle tube station of people sheltering from the Blitz. And this appeared in Camera in London, a book that he published, I think, in 1948. And to prepare that, I'm giving you a detail here of the airbrush on this highlight on the shoulder of this man. And he's actually worked in some stripes, and he says, keep that checker on the back of the paper. So he's toning that down. He wants that to recess a little bit, but he's also making sure that the printer is attentive to this fine detail that he's adding. And as I say, when you get upstairs and you start looking at these prints of Bill Brandt's, think about these interventions, because they're all over the place. And when you see something like this, Bill Brandt is just, at least in my mind, just immediately present.
Absolutely, and Paul and I visited many photo collections and looked at hundreds of Bill Brandt prints, and in the exhibition, I wanted to see if we could hold on to some of that variety. And again, it's something that we expect with an artist like Henry Moore, to really think of each thing as individual and unique. But when it comes to photograph, and especially with an artist like, who's making reprints and variations over the years, over the decades, and you'll see the same image in different repositories over and over again. And yet each one has this imprint of his hand and of being an individual object too. So in the exhibition, we've used these cases as a kind of an attempt to hold on to that materiality, so that both artists are kind of presented in the richness of the individual object. And I think, a lot of photo exhibitions, depending on what your goal is when you're curating an exhibition, as soon as you put a frame and a mat on something, it becomes something different. And it may be that you want a uniform exhibition with same size frames and to really have everything very regularized. But that's not what I wanted to do here. I really wanted people to notice what Paul just talked about, the varieties of the printing paper, the crooked, cut by scissors edges. Sometimes there's a margin, sometimes there isn't. There are scribbles underneath, there are numbers crossed out, quite ugly, nothing sort of precious about it, on the white border. And you start to see why those prints were made and start to understand the process that's behind these. So just to give you a little bit of an example of what I'm talking about. So, here we have a case with these 3 10 by 8 prints. One is sort of cut close to the white edge. The other 2 have these margins underneath. There are numbers that loosely correspond to the numbers of the page numbers of Perspective of Nudes. Mm-hmm. So Bill Brandt is thinking about the sequencing of the pictures in the book, the juxtapositions he wants to make with the double plate. So these are working prints. These are exhibition prints, and I really love these. These are from the Bill Brandt Archive, and it's just an incredible relic from 1962, or 1961, in fact, when MoMA did this exhibition to coincide with Bill Brandt's publication, Perspective of Nudes. And I think this is them. So they're unglazed, and they're mounted onto these boards with these black painted edges. And you get this sort of very immediate access. There's no white borders, there's no mats, no frames. So it's a very particular experience of these pictures. And I love the time travel that you can do, and thinking about this is how visitors went to MoMA to see a photo show in 1961. And then these are from the British Council. So Bill Brandt was kind of picked up as the first photographer that the British Council worked with. British Council is very much an organ that promoted Henry Moore, traveling exhibitions of Henry Moore all around the world after the war, on kind of a diplomatic cultural mission, sending exhibitions around the world. And when they started to work with Bill Brandt, he printed these very large pictures, of his whole photo archive, early and newer pictures. And so this is what you would see if you went to a British Council exhibition. This is in New Zealand in 1979. So this is how audiences saw Bill Brandt then. And I find that quite fascinating to sort of think about how, Bill Brandt's practice changed, how his printing changed in response to, becoming seen as an artist, becoming desired as an exhibiting artist. One more point I want to make about that is, so these are two other examples of exhibition prints made from earlier works. So on the left is a print that was made for a MoMA exhibition. Again, no borders, very sort of rich, beautiful, saturated blacks. On the right-hand side, another one of these 1970s British Council prints. But the other thing to notice is that Bill Brandt and Henry Moore went back to their shelter pictures and their wartime pictures over and over again. And of course, these are so famous and so iconic. They're part of how we think about, part of the visual culture of the Second World War and how we think about that. And it's not just because they're great pictures, but because they were promoted, reprinted, reimagined, reissued again and again and again by the artists. So the artists had a lot of agency in how their works sort of continued to be visible. They never really went off view. And I'm showing you here a tapestry, which is upstairs, that Henry Moore had woven in 1986. It's one of a series. And they're based on the shelter drawings. So 40 years later, he's going back to his little drawings and scaling them up for a new moment. So I'm going to hand back to Paul to just talk a little bit about, trying to hold on to the materiality of the object in the exhibition. And we also wanted to do that in the book.
Yeah, definitely. Let's just see where so we've talked a lot about, well, not a lot. We haven't had a lot of time. We could talk all night probably about Henry Moore's process and Bill Brandt's process. But I wanted to show a little bit of our process. Our process when it came to trying to convey these material qualities in the book on the printed page. And so this is how the print, this is, again, London during the Blitz, a print in the exhibition. And this is how it appears in the book. And this is something that we worked really hard to figure out, how to capture these kind of three-dimensional qualities and also capture, again, some of the, not obliterate, but actually honestly show, condition issues that maybe indicate how the print was handled over time or how that print is really moving through time. So this is the four dimensions that we talk about in one of the essays in the book. And so how do we do that? Well, first we photographed the print as you normally would, with kind of lights at 45-degree angles. And that gives you the image, that captures the image really, really well. And then we did something that you should never do if you want to make a good reproduction. And we deliberately, we went for it, which is to make a speculative light shot. Make the print shine like a mirror as best you can. And what that does is it captures the gloss, and it captures any sort of change in gloss, defect in gloss. And with Brandt, he's playing with gloss constantly. Gloss, it creates optical saturation. The glossier you go, the deeper the blacks you get. As a pre-press step, that's a really essential thing. So we wanted to capture gloss. Gloss is not great for exhibition. If you have lights bouncing off your print, that's a bad thing, right? And so you tend to use more matte papers for exhibition. So some of those MoMA prints, and you'll see in the show, this differences in the gloss axis. So we thought this was important to capture. And then, in register, keeping everything sort of lined up so they stack together, making a Raking Light view. And here you see some of the texture on a kind of two different scales, sort of the curl of the print, but you also see some of those tiny little ripples and handling crimps and all of that. And if you take these three images and you stack them in Photoshop, and you start playing with the transparency of the layers, you can sort of dial in this experience of the print. And this is exactly what Martina and I would do. We would sit, and we were lucky. Our lenders were tremendous and gave us tremendous access. We would hold the print in our hands, and then on the screen, dial in, by changing the transparency of these different layers, dial in our experience in that moment of the photograph. And that's what was put into the book. So, okay, here's the Raking Light shot. And this is what we were left with. And again, it's got some of the texture elements, it's got some of the gloss elements, it's got the image as really well conveyed. What it's missing, though, in our sort of trompe-l'oeil kind of situation is a shadow. And so the shadow is something that it's based on the Raking Light photograph, but it's actually completely fabricated to give the print, to stand the print away from that gray background. And I had some misgivings about this a little bit, because it's a conceit. But what's more of a conceit? What's a higher level of mediation? The image on the right, where you slap a mat on it and you negate all of its material qualities and you just say, it's an image. Or the one that we chose on the left. And, I think what we achieved in the book in terms of the reproduction of photographic prints is really, it's new. In my mind, it sets a new bar for how photographic prints are depicted in museum catalogs, exhibition catalogs, maybe auction catalogs, who knows, into the future. So that's a little behind the scenes view into our process.
Yeah, and I was so thrilled that we were able to do this. And as Paul said, a lot of things had to line up to be able to get the prints here. And our lenders were so generous in allowing us to have the prints come and visit here long before the show happened. And I'm going to end with some thanks, actually, because as anybody who's made a show knows, or a book, it takes a small village. And so many people collaborated with us to make this possible. Just want to add that, as a curator, or when you work on a project, you have this incredibly privileged access to the objects, and it's always a conundrum how you can hold on to that, how you can let visitors to the exhibition, how you can retain some of that. And I was really thrilled with this book that it has a different experience to it, which that these images are not just illustrations. You really get a sense of their dimensionality. So yeah, I'm going to end with some thanks. So first of all, I do want to thank, again, all of our lenders for sticking with us through the rescheduling, closings and reopenings when the show was on in Britain, and then our repeated rescheduling here. And I do want to call out the Henry Moore Foundation and the Bill Brandt Estate and Bill Brandt Archive for their incredible generosity. The bulk of the loans came from them, and without their support, collegiality, knowledge, expertise, everything they shared, but we couldn't have done this show. I want to thank our donors and benefactors. Huge thanks to David Deckman and Michelle McCure. Thank you, David, for sharing your collection with us and your expertise. To the John Pritzker Family Fund, both for supporting this project and supporting the Lens Media Lab here at Yale. To James and Laura Duncan and their long-standing generosity to the center, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, who sponsored our exhibition and publications workshop. I owe huge thanks to Amy Myers, the former director of the Yale Center for British Art, who supported this project from the outset. And then Courtney J. Martin, when she came on board, extended her support to us in the most generous way. The book that Paul just talked a little bit about, I just want to thank the team. So Mika McGinty, who's here, her colleague Rita Jules for their incredible design work, Thomas Palmer and Daniel Frank, and last but not least, my dear colleagues here, Bob Hickson and Richard Caspel, who did this photography, and without them we couldn't have pulled this off. So huge thanks to them. I want to thank our exhibition partners, the Hepworth, Wakefield. Huge thanks to Simon Wallace and Eleanor Clayton, who came on board right from the start and came on this long journey with us. And I also want to thank the Sainsbury Centre, who joined a little later so that this exhibition was seen at 3 venues, which was wonderful. Having just installed the show here, it's been an amazing process. I want to thank Julie Fry, our designer, who is very visible upstairs in terms of the signage in the exhibition. It's really wonderful. And there are many, many people here that I won't get to thank, but I want to sort of reserve my really heartfelt thanks to our head of installations, Kevin Durkin, and our chief registrar, Corey Myers, who have just been such incredible colleagues in all aspects of the exhibition, and they're such a joy to work with, and I'm just so enormously grateful for their quiet, diligent, behind-the-scenes work, but they made everything happen upstairs. So thank you to everybody for coming. Thanks to everybody who helped with this project. Paul and I are going to be around having a drink and going into the show, so I invite you to come and chat with us. Enjoy the exhibition. Thank you for coming.